Hi, welcome back to another Evolutionary Astrology Zoom meeting. I'm Bradley Naragon, and today we're going to talk about astrology of the now. This is a bit misleading of a title, sort of on purpose. I'm just going to share today something that I've been playing with, and the idea is, this is kind of funny because we've all probably been studying astrology for various amounts of time. And what we're going to go over today is, I would say it's definitely a little more like intermediate level, but I'd definitely welcome anyone to play around with this. Because I've been doing astrology for 20 years, and this is the first time I started doing this technique. And I haven't really heard about it anywhere else. And so it's kind of weird to be being like, hey, here's this thing. But I decided to share this because I've been looking at it for a little while and actually really fascinated by what I found for myself. So basically what it is the idea that, in astrology, a relationship chart is a composite chart, right? And we typically just look at our relationship to the now with transits to our natal chart, progressions, etc. And the idea here, of course, is forming a composite chart with the now, or with the transits, right? So what I've been doing is having a file in my astrology app, whichever one you're using, because you can't, at least in the ones I've used, you can't form a composite chart unless you save the chart as an event. So I just have a chart that I save as now, and I just change the date all the time on that, so I can rerun my relationship to the now chart, composite now. This is my chart for myself on the inside. This is a lot to look at, so we're going to go slow. I don't have a ton of material here. I just want to kind of grease the wheels and introduce the idea and encourage people to explore this technique and see what they discover for themselves. But basically, this was a day that happened recently, 12 days ago approximately. And you look at all my transits, which is a lot of them, obviously, I've got a lot of like bigger transits going on. The one transit on this day that really stood out as significant for me because of how close to being exact it was, as far as like why would something happen on this day, was the South Node transiting my natal Mars. That's within a couple minutes there. Basically, I'll just do very, very briefly, just a little bit of sharing, but if you see a South Node Mars kind of contact like this, especially if the individual's Mars is significant in the core EA signature. So if you look at this chart, there's a South Node in Aries in the natal chart, so that Mars is ruler of the South Node. So for us, that makes transits to the natal Mars very significant because it's transiting the ruler of the South Node, right? Makes sense. So having the South Node transit the ruler of the South Node, you would imagine that there could be some kind of, past life relive, a trigger of some kind of past life event, some issues coming up. And yeah, sure, there are on many different levels with this. But on this day in particular, there was one event that triggered basically like kind of like a fear and terror, kind of like in a traumatic way that was really challenging. Like, when you have, there's like a point where you have like fear like actually like shudder through your body, and it will change your digestive system, and like you're gonna need to poop and stuff, like that level of intensity, in proportional to the events that were happening that day. So when I look at this and I see that south node on the Mars, sure, that is one thing to look at for that event. But and of course, Mars with its two moons, I can't remember the like Phobos and Demos. Like they mean fear and panic, right? So the whole like Mars, fight, flight, freeze, fear, adrenaline, right? These are all kind of Mars issues. So to have that come up, and basically, but also when we have something really deep come up, it also represents trauma, right? In some access to some deeper wound that was traumatic. So this here, I just highlighted what I'm talking about. There's that south node on the Mars. I circled my Uranus because I was also thinking, well, there was kind of like this level of trauma in the event, but Uranus in particular by transit, and my natal Uranus, wasn't like jumping out at me, and nor was like significant 11th house things. This chart here has my composite to that moment in time around the natal chart. Again, it's a lot to look at, but immediately what I saw was Sun and Mars, which if you've been doing astrology for a while, you know that the Sun and the Mars are both things that can activate or set off something, right? And in this case, in the composite now chart, that Sun and Mars were like kind of like midpointing, kind of sandwiching that Uranus. And when I saw that, it just made so much sense, because it felt like that kind of like it was coming from that very deep Uranus Scorpio 8th house thing, and I didn't have something else to tie to this, right? So it's just a little example of this. This is just my own composite now chart. And so when I look at these, this is for right now, I look at the chart in general first. I'll just be like, this is my composite now chart. So this chart in some way represents my relationship to this moment in time. He was like, everyone's having all the transits, everyone's having all these Capricorn planets transiting, right? We have the whole planet and everybody having the same, planets in Virgo right now, right? But the idea here is that we all have our own relationship to this moment. And that's what this chart is. It's a reflection of our relationship to this moment in time. So I've been just kind of looking at it and seeing what comes up. And so, for example, one thing that come up for me is here. I put that chart then around my natal chart. The my composite now Saturn. So the outer planets, of course, are going to be moving a lot slower, even slower than by transit, right? If you have an outer planet that's going to move 3 degrees in a year, in the composite now, because it's going to be a midpoint, here's one point and then it moves 3 degrees closer. So that midpoint method only actually changed 1.5 degrees. So for outer planets, you're going to want to notice how exact they are, and if and when they line up with something in your chart. So for example, for myself, when I ran the composite now, I noticed that I've been having this Saturn on my north node in Libra and it's kind of just a theme that's going on for months of my life, as I'm relating to this year of my life. And that's been really, it's been there's a lot I can correlate to that actually. And I don't have another symbol or thing that I've been looking at that correlates to this. It's like there's all these threads that weave the fabric of reality. And I always think like, well, that's why we like astrology, because we can actually get into the fabric of reality and say, if we have our correlations accurate and we can synthesize we can trace back and be like, oh my gosh, that's where we see that. That's where we see this pattern, right? So I'm a little blown away because I'm seeing another level of my relationship to my life and what's going on that I hadn't been seeing. So I'm just been playing with this. I don't have a real definitive, statement about it. I just think it's for those of us who are familiar enough and comfortable enough to do this kind of thing. I just throw it out there as just look at it. Look at your relationship composite now chart. Observe what the archetype and themes are and see if anything comes up. Maybe not. And then the next level is putting that around your natal chart and seeing what kind of contacts happen. So that is that, basically. So we're going to go into, this is Francisco. This is our first volunteer, and you're here. Can you unmute?
Ready.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So this is the natal chart. And so I'm just going to move forward. So now this chart here is the composite now chart, taking Francisco's natal chart, and actually I just did 4:30 my time today at the start of this meeting for this chart. So so this chart represents your relationship to this moment in time. That's the idea. Now, one of the things that I'm looking at that I actually hadn't thought of before is we've got a really beautiful grand trine in the water signs from Pluto, and especially like a Pluto in Scorpio to Uranus in Cancer, and then Saturn conjunct Vesta in Pisces. So, I mean, if you've been doing astrology a while, you might know what it feels like when you've got a really big grand trine going. So it's kind of this idea that for you right now, your relationship to this moment is that it would be there would be this sense of being able to like get in the flow and harmonize with your relationship to now. So it's just kind of a funny lens, and I guess that comes back as a question to you of what do you in brief, does that, what comes to mind when you hear that?
So, well, I kind of, my connection is not so good, but for what I understand, yes, I've been dealing with many emotions that have been in my subconsciousness for decades. So I'm laying them out, and it's been a hard process because I became aware of them, bring them to the light. Then I need to process them and adjust, be in my center again. It's not that easy.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And so so what we're going to do now is we're going to jump to, so now this is the composite now around the natal chart. And so thinking about what Francisco just said, when we go down, so I want you to look at the fourth house, and we see that the composite Pluto and Mars are down there in the fourth house, and they've been there for a long time. This actually kind of speaks to what you just said, as far as a Pluto fourth house transit, of course, is a lot of pretty intense emotional work, and it just so happens that in this composite now around the natal, we have Pluto in the fourth house with Mars right there. They're, they're tiptoeing up on that Jupiter in Scorpio in the fourth house. Because we see this grand trine happening around it, it would represent that while there's been a lot of this deep, intense emotional work going on, and of course with Jupiter there, it's like, wow, it's like the stuff's emerging and coming up even bigger than, like, okay, this is really big emotions, really intense. So, I would just say, yeah. And then there's this sort of like a grace or ability to integrate this level of what's coming up, kind of in the vein of, some people say, like, we're not given more than we can handle. And that's obviously pretty debatable statement, but a lot of times, we look at our life and it's like, wow, what's coming at us is really hard. It's really intense. But for some reason right now we have the ability to work with it. Sometimes you imagine in the past having the same stuff come up and like, I don't know how I would have handled that then, but I feel a little more equipped now. So that's one idea there. I made a bunch of marks here to just kind of, so if we start up in the 12th house, I put a little tick mark on that Uranus. This is the composite now Uranus. It moves really slow, so it's going to be a couple years before it hits that moon. There could very well be some themes that's bringing up now. I would definitely, I would say, to me, it's something to keep an eye on, because in a couple years when it's exact, to see what's coming up then, and if it relates to patterns now. Obviously the moon in a composite now chart's really fleeting. It's kind of really truly like the moment in time that we're in. A snapshot here. So, but I circled it because it joined up with Paulus and it's hitting the south node right now. So that's interesting. It's like, it kind of raises the question of, with that on the south node, what's coming in from the past into consciousness in this moment in time.
Many things that I know for sure. Yes.
And with Paulus there, with some of these things, would there be that? Well, I mean, when I use Paulus, one of the things I think of a lot is just that there's this, she represents a feminine wisdom. She represents this capacity of the mind to kind of strategically work out puzzles. And so it could be that there could be some strategies emerging in consciousness. I don't know if that's true.
Actually, yes. There have been many changes, and of the thought patterns that I got from my family of origin, fourth house. They have a certain way of handling the money, handling the authority, and now I'm challenging all that. Developing my own sense of authority, my own way of handling money. And that has caused me many problems here. Actually, my maternal family, like my uncles and aunts, said I am no longer part of their family. I'm expelled of the clan. Pluto in the fall, I guess. Which is a great thing, actually. I love that. Because that means that they acknowledge that I'm no longer in their obsolete, toxic structure.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. It's interesting how what you're sharing fits this grand trine, and the Pluto moving through the fourth house, with this composite now. Something like where the sun is in this chart and Venus and Mercury, these are really quick movers. So, it's really more of kind of a flavor to the moment, so to speak, you know. So I just circled that because I was like, oh, look, you know, the Sun and Venus in a conjunction in Virgo there does add a little bit of flavor. And there would be right after that the Mercury in Virgo. So, you know, you have these little extra layers. There would be a little Mercury return. So I'm going to move on here. Unless is there anything else that you wanted to share or thoughts?
Well, I don't know how this relates to all this, but since, well, about a month, my youngest son moved to live with me. There was several years without seeing each other because of his mother. She hates me, and she didn't want to see them because she said it's bad influence. But then he turned 18 and said, I want to move with my father, and he's living with me right now. But I also am taking care of my parents. My father is terminally ill, and my mother broke her left hip. So I'm like running the household. I'm in charge of my two parents and my youngest son. There was one weekend when the three of them were ill. Well, my son got his 4 wisdom teeth removed. He was in bed. My two parents in bed, and I was like, I'm in charge of everything, and I'm the only one who is healthy. You know what this?
Wow.
How does this?
It's interesting to, you know, I mean, when you were talking about that, of course, I was thinking of all these Capricorn planets in transit, and in your natal chart, you've got Vesta in Capricorn there. And I'm also noticing how this composite now, Neptune joins in that whole conglomeration. So where you've got Saturn and Pluto now, and where they'll be, there's this Neptune layer there too. All that being in your 6th house,
Right.
somewhat adds up to what you're talking about. And, you know, like even at like a little base level, like, you know, Neptune, this ideal of taking on the responsibility, you know, of helping, you know, Neptune and Capricorn in the 6th. And of course it's on your Vesta, and you know, where Vesta obviously can be that point of focus. And right now it seems like that's a very big focus, is your responsibility to be helping and others heal in your life and supporting them.
Yeah. Plus my internal work, plus running my business. So it's
Right.
boring. There's no time to get bored, actually.
Thank you so much for willing to have your chart up and be here today. I'm going to move on here. Thank you. Okay, this is our second. Jennifer volunteered to give us her chart and look at. So this is a brief glance at the natal chart, and from the natal chart we did a composite chart again, just for today, for right now. And you know, when you see how Saturn and Pluto are very close to each other there, which they are in transit right now, that would show that you know, they're also close in the natal chart, so they're kind of moving together. Or no, scratch that. I'm sorry, that's not. Never mind. The thing that jumped out for me immediately when I saw this relationship to now is how many planets are in Cancer right now. So it's kind of this idea of, you know, if you look at it, transits, and you had, or your progress chart, and you had that many planets in Cancer or the 4th house, you would say, wow, that's a lot of Cancer going on. You know, what issues of my own identity, my own sense of self and security, emotional security issues are coming up. Right. So to have all those right now, and then I did like an inner circle because we actually have the North Node Mars and Mercury all in a conjunction there together right now in this chart. So to me, I see that, and immediately it throws this idea out that in this moment, so Jennifer's relationship to this moment in time, there would be a theme of, Mercury, Mars, North Node, Cancer, right? Having the courage to deliver her message and being secure in what um, wants to be communicated. So it's interesting because you wouldn't see that as a theme necessarily otherwise, which is why I'm a proponent of you trying this method just to see what may come for yourself. And when we put this around, obviously, it's like, whoa, there's so much to look at here. But the thing that really jumped out for me was that Saturn Pluto that I noticed. I was like, yeah, they're in a conjunction, and they're in a conjunction right now by transit too. But then when I saw that here, it's totally activating that Uranus Jupiter in Sagittarius there. So and again, we've got transiting Jupiter in Sagittarius. So this could be very well a situation where somebody looks at that transit of Jupiter to their Jupiter, Uranus, and Sag, and the timing of it, but there's this whole other deeper, kind of more intense layer going on there to how we're relating to that transit in this moment in time. So, if that makes sense. And
so yeah, it's a lot of questioning or restructuring beliefs I've been going through, and a lot of Cancer stuff in terms of feelings and literally actually physically feeling it in the body, which sort of, I guess, reflects the first house. I guess stellium of planets there too. So it's a lot of it is I'm changing the way I'm thinking based on how I'm feeling, and it's a lot of very deep stuff that I'm going through, like almost dealing with inner child sort of nurturing and understanding the trauma that I've been sort of endured in the past, and then reframing how I believe or what I interpret it to be, and sort of healing that part of it. So I guess that reflects both the Pluto and Saturn, which is sort of going through that work, and as well as that side of Cancer where it's completely based on how sort of that inner security and that feelings aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Did you have something to correlate that to the deeper, evolution and of your beliefs and how you interpret life? What were you correlating that to that you were experiencing up till now?
Well, there's a lot of sort of relationship issues. I've recently gotten into a relationship, and sort of that's actually drawing up a lot of that interaction and sort of that projections that comes from relationships itself. So that's been dragging up a lot of the issues that I've been working through at the same time. So I think that's probably reflective of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hearing you say that now, it's interesting that this composite now South node, it happens to be in the 6th house, and then is ruled by that Saturn, which goes back to the whole big conjunction there. Yeah. is there anything else that when you did this, that you noticed or thought about where you're like, well, this is interesting, or any comments?
I just find it interesting that the center of it, because the one that I believe you sent me was a lot of fourth house and Cancer at the same time. So it was I was like, oh, it's just completely that Cancer based, that inner child healing because of the Pluto side of things, I think. So it's like restructuring what I believed or believe, and sort of rebuilding myself from scratch again at the same time.
Thank you for sharing that. If you hear a train, sorry, I live by a train now. Going off of one of the classic EA ways to approach this, if you look at, that Mars and Mercury in Cancer with the North Node in the first house. So there's first house, process of self-discovery, and all that's forming this pretty tight inconjunct to that Saturn, especially that Mars Saturn's in an inconjunct, full phase inconjunct, right? And the Mercury Pluto, and so that so in that process of discovering oneself, that crisis of analyzing sixth house and then restructuring how reality itself is interpreted, it's pretty fascinating how it actually does relate to what you're going through.
Yeah.
Is there any other thing you want to share, or I'm going to move on to our last example here?
I think I'm good.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is someone who's not present, but this is their composite now chart, and I've been doing a lot of, since they're a friend, we've been doing a lot of dialogue, and I've been exploring, kind of trying to tease out, and be like, does this correlate to anything, or is this just, when I look at the composite now chart, I saw that two of the things that really jumped out at me just in the chart itself was this Jupiter Ceres conjunction in Aquarius. So we may not combine those archetypes in our life. We'd have no reason to combine them, but if we ran our composite now chart and suddenly there's a Jupiter Ceres conjunction in Aquarius, you might say, well, what does that mean that my relationship to now has that thread going through this moment too? The other one that jumped out is the Saturn Chiron conjunction in Aries. There is pretty tight. So because this is not me personally, I can't really look at this and say anything else. If it was myself, it's a lot more meaningful because you're actually looking at a chart that represents your personal relationship to this moment in time. So you may immediately get some hits or some, wow, that's really interesting. So really the next thing that I always do then is I put it around the natal chart. And so here, his natal chart's on the inside and the composite now is around it. And so there's that Saturn Chiron happens to be hitting Eris, which is, Eris isn't really one of those aspects of the psyche and consciousness that we're necessarily in a heightened aware state all the time. It's out there, and so I also think it's a little bit more of a subtle, deeper level in the psyche. Except, when it's really being highlighted, obviously if it's in an exact conjunction with personal planets in the natal chart, et cetera, et cetera. And if we're really familiar with seeing the archetypes, we may see how it's playing out. But if you look at this chart, look at the inside natal chart. In the first house, there's Saturn in Cancer, 11 degrees. So what we know is, I don't have it on a transit, there would be a Saturn opposition right now, right? The midlife Saturn opposition. And so it's interesting because with Saturn being really highlighted by transit, anytime you're a Saturn opposition, it's pretty, like, that card is up, right? So to have Saturn Chiron conjunction in this composite now exact in Aries in the 11th house. And one of the things that they did share with me was that they were actually like initiating, creating more community in their life, and had just invited a bunch of astrologer friends over. And so that was, I mean, it's pretty much like exactly fitting that. Obviously, when we have a lot of planets in the 11th house, and Chiron's also in the 11th house natally, and Venus is in the 11th house natally, there can already be that, that wound of being in some lifetime, right, a social outcast, not fitting in, trying to discover and seek one's tribe or community. So to hear a story that there's this act of, initiating and creating community in that way, and so then there's this layer and thread of healing there. So we talked about that and introduced that concept. As far as the Ceres Jupiter transit goes, they had a bunch of correlations, and I don't have it down enough because Jupiter does move faster by transit. A little earlier in the year, Jupiter would have been actually closer to that Mars, and in the 9th house, and it did correlate with some of the themes that were being, taught and disseminated by this person at that time. I circled, and finally, I circled over there the Mercury. So it's just a composite now, Mercury, but it's gonna transit that south node, and it's kind of right now it's between the moon and the south node. It's going to transit the south node. So I've been messaging. I'm like, is there any kind of Mercury south node thing happening for you? Just playing around and exploring, but that's going to hit in tonight and tomorrow. It's still not really exactly on that south node, so so far not necessarily so. And then I put in the 6th house, you can see I put a little hash mark on that Pluto at 29 Scorpio. This is one of those things I would say eventually, because Pluto moves so darn slow, it needs to move that would be, it's 3 degrees of Sag plus a half a degree at the end of Scorpio. But then it's a midpoint, so it's got to move like a full 6 degrees. So it's going to be some years. It's going to be some years before that composite now Pluto is on the north node. But when it is, it'll be very fascinating to see what deeper layer of evolution is happening then. And it could be one of those things too, where when it does actually shift signs, there could be, so when the composite now Pluto actually enters into Sagittarius, it's like it's an energetic shift right there. It could introduce some of the themes that then are going to emerge later when it does reach that exactly. So that's about all I have for you. And if anyone has any questions or comments, you're welcome to now if we still have some time.
Hi, Bradley. This is great. I love it. But how different is it to just putting your transits on top of your chart? Because that would be the same thing though, wouldn't it?
Well, right. Well, how do you differentiate that?
But I like what you're doing. It's taking it one step further.
I've been trying to find the words of how to say how it's different than transits, and I remember Steve Wolfson saying that, Jeff always taught that, he basically mainly just worked with transits because he'd say that it would show up, themes will show up in multiple places, and typically, they would show up in transits, or you find something in progression, it's also here, kind of. So that I've thought of that a lot too, and as someone who's watched their own transits for over 20 years now, doing this, it's I guess I'm going to try, it's more, the transit's a more direct impact on who we are, is one way that I've noticed it. So if we have a transit, that's like a thing that's happening, and how we relate to that thing happening, to me, that's where this chart comes in a little bit.
It's sort of like having two partners and just drawing up the composite chart, it being a third entity. Yeah?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, yeah, it's an entity that we don't think about a lot when we think about our relative experience of this moment in time is our relationship to this moment in time. And that's what this is.
That's fantastic. Dawn says, the transits happen to us. This reflects how we work with and relate to the transits. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And also, Bradley, it made me think of horary charts, horary questions. They're drawn up for the now moment. Have you thought of that? Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Not in relation to this, no.
No. Okay, but it's similar. Okay, any further questions or comments?
I do. Bradley, I was wondering if I love what you're doing here. This is beautiful. I wonder if you have kind of analyzed the chart standing by itself to look at things like the basics, the obvious, like this is a kind of a Martian locomotive chart, if you will, in its framing, and the weighting of the elements and the signs themselves in relation to the way you normally behave, how those work together, kind of a partnership kind of idea. Have you been working that out as well?
Well, that's a great question. I've come to learn over time that it's really important to always know the core natal chart first, as what that really says. And I think it is really easy to get lost in, there's so much information just on one's transits to natal chart, but also if people are using different systems, pulling different techniques from different traditions, there's so much that's going on. And so and I may be missing what you're saying a little bit, but to me, what came up was this idea of synthesis, yes, and also, but in relation to the core themes in the chart itself. And that's definitely something that I've been thinking about and looking. So like, for example, the chart that's still on the screen right now, there's a Venus Chiron conjunction natally in Aries. So having a Saturn Chiron activation in this composite now, it kind of like, it seems even more significant, because it's like, well, I was already kind of a thing going on there, am I getting what you're saying at all, or can you speak?
Definitely, you're on it. What I was saying more succinctly, I can definitely clarify that. This chart, the natal, is more like a splay chart, or more like a splay. And this chart, and a splay in and of itself is very kind of diffuse. A scatter here, a focus here, a focus there, right? But this chart, in relation to now, he will find himself more focused because this is a Martian conjunct Pluto locomotive. You know, he's on a frickin' drive. He's he's probably driving towards something, if I'm reading the connection accurately. So that was my point.
Right, and now that you say that too, what I want to do for this person is fast forward to when that Mars-Pluto conjunction's exact, and then hit them up the next day and say, so what do you think of this now? And so it is a little bit of I'm experimenting, I'm playing with it, but also for myself, I've been a little bit blown away, to be honest, about how it's kind of given me this other lens of how I am relating to what's going on right now.
Totally. I put it up against my own, and it's amazing. I'm blown away too. Thank you, Bradley.
Bradley, thanks for bringing something really new to astrology. This is fantastic. I love it. Would you mind going back to your chart of the now, please? And the composite? That one. Yeah. When you said you received a real fright or a real shock about something on that day, 12 days ago, I also noticed, is there another chart before that?
Let's see. This was the transit one.
That one, yeah. That Saturn is squaring your Pluto. And on top of that, and that the rulers of your nodes in the natal, Venus and Mars, are sextile. And I don't know, I was just playing around and following it through, and somewhere I saw an inconjunct between, can't remember the planets, but it really seemed to me that there were repeating themes taking place. That actually, when I saw you today on your video, you looked like you'd had a fright. My intuition was telling me like, oh, he looks a bit freaked out. And then you started speaking about it. And so I thought that was very interesting. And I hope you're feeling better now, actually.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying, Linda, makes total sense, because I would say, going back to what I was saying, is like how Jeff says things show up. Well, with Pluto, with Saturn square Pluto like that, and my Pluto in the 7th house, that definitely correlates to it. But I didn't really have a symbol until I looked here for that deeper impact.
Yes.
How I was relating, like that event happened, but how I was relating to it. This tells that story.
Wow, we all want to go out and draw up our composite now charts. It's fantastic. Great. And you can draw them up for the future as well?
Yeah, I mean, you just pick any date, and then you have to save that chart as an event, and then combine them.
And if you're in a group of people, you could compare the now moment of that future event with every member of that group. Yeah?
Yeah. It's right. I mean, it's interesting idea. It's like there could be this really, like the great conjunction that everyone's talking about in 2020. It's like we're all going to have our own real experience of what that is for us, and of course it'll be defined by who we are, how we respond to it, our transits. But I would say that there's also that we'll have a relationship to that time, and this would also give some more information about how we all relate to that time differently.
Could be interesting to draw one up for the presidential election and see what's happening.
I almost started playing with that, but I didn't. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So any final any final questions from our audience?
I don't have a question, but Bradley, I love this. I've looked at this a little bit in different ways, but I love that you're putting words to it and presenting it, because it's something that I've noticed before. Because my Sirius software will show down in the corner, it'll show where the composite planets are when you put a transit chart over a natal chart. I've noticed at times that, oh, that lines up with my, sun or something, and I've thought it interesting. I'm glad that you're doing this. This is very cool.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, Bradley, that brings us to the end of your meeting. Thank you so much. Thank you to your volunteers.
Thank you again.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you to Jennifer and Francisco and to Wanda. Would you all please thank Bradley Naragon?
Thank you,
Thank you,
Bradley.
Bradley.
That was excellent.